For TRICHOMES.com, I'm Jesse Betend, and this is The High Ground. On this show, we talk to leaders of the cannabis community, everyone from CEOs to politicians and farmers, anyone who's making an impact on the cannabis community and beyond. I'm not sure if you can hear the cicadas roaring outside my window right now. It's the time of the year when it's still a little bit too hot to close the window, but the cicadas are out. It's also the time of the year when every fourth year we have a presidential election. Coronavirus has understandably dominated the public health debate for much of this year, and it's going to be one of the main issues in November's presidential election. But it's far from America's only public health crisis. Previously, a cornerstone of Donald Trump's 2016 stump speech, the opiate crisis is no more solved than it was 4 years ago. Today, I'm talking to Dr. Kyle Kingsley, CEO and chairman of Vireo Health. Dr. Kingsley spent a decade as an emergency medicine specialist before he walked away to start a cannabis company. More on his spouse's reaction to that in just a minute. Dr. Kingsley freely admits that modern medicine is not very good at managing chronic pain. But as a doctor who's sworn an ethical oath to protect, an oath which, fun fact, old versions of which actually include a promise not to prescribe deadly drugs. For someone like that, to get into cannabis, what goes into that decision? What would you need to know before you were comfortable? Well, we're going to get into it. Dr. Kingsley, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's go back to what you were doing before you got into cannabis. What was your career vocation like?
Yeah, so I actually board certified in emergency medicine, and I spent a decade doing that in a suburban emergency department. I did a lot of moonlighting in multiple hospitals, multiple states, actually. Trained at a local level 1 trauma center here in Minneapolis, Hennepin County Medical Center. Have had a serial kind of entrepreneurship bug for quite some time, built some really unsexy businesses in the medical documentation space. And so, that really allowed me to make a lot of quick, cost-effective mistakes over the decade or so before I entered cannabis. And so, between horticulture, my love of medicine, and sort of the entrepreneurship bug, when Minnesota came up with a restrictive, medically focused cannabis law, it was just irresistible to me. And fortunately, I have a very supportive wife who somehow allowed me to move on from emergency medicine and that comfortable, supportive job and full on into this space, which has been amazing but chaotic, as you know.
Sure. Not to pry too much, but what were some of those conversations like?
Yeah, I tell people the story, and I maybe have romanticized this a bit, but I distinctly remember approaching her. She was, I think, 8 months pregnant at the time, or well along in pregnancy. And I said, look, I have an awesome idea. Let's take out a mortgage on a greenhouse that we can't afford for this medical marijuana license that we don't have. And I can quit my job and you can support me. What do you say? And, somehow she said yes to that. She's always been supportive of sort of my entrepreneurial undertakings. We have had some success with the other businesses, as uninteresting as they are. And so, that was a huge hurdle there. We actually got a straight up mortgage on our first greenhouse in Minnesota, which was pretty unusual. Both we and the banks were a little bit naive at that time, but that was a great start. I then approached my dad in southeastern Minnesota, a small farming community named Harmony, Minnesota, about some startup funds. I don't run in circles of financially enabled circles. I'm from a small farming community, pretty humble means. And so I was hoping to raise $200,000 or $300,000 one night back in July of 2014. We got a bunch of farmers, some teachers, veterinarians, stuff around the fire, and they actually committed to $1.2 million on my first ever pitch for what was then MinMed, which eventually became Vireo. And that's a lot of money for a small town like Harmony. It still is a lot of money in my mind. And my hometown has subsequently thrown down probably $2 million more into Vireo. We have investors from across the country, but a lot of Minnesotans still. And so immensely proud of sort of our Minnesota roots. As you know, kind of being from the Midwest carries a certain gravitas, a certain in business, there are a lot of people that invest specifically in Midwestern companies because of sort of the ethics that they bring to the table. And it's just kind of a hardworking team doing things the right way. We're not apologizing for building a real business. A little bit less hype than some of our counterparts, but very proud of what we've done. Very proud of our roots here in Minnesota.
So there's a second part to this question, but part One is, do you think that your background as a physician helped to convince people to kind of believe that you were going to be able to pull this off?
Yeah, it definitely did. When we started this back in 2014, it was still kind of a highly unprofessional, business space. It was just, even up north in Canada, it was still sort of the Wild West. And so for me to come in as a professional, with surrounded by professionals, that was pretty differentiating. And so, we've been able to raise a lot of funds over the last several years, and early on, especially, that was very important. Now physicians in business, that's kind of a mixed bag, not the best reputation. I like to think that I've been so humbled by the other entrepreneurial undertakings, and then of course the cannabis space, that I hope that I've mitigated a lot of the problems that physicians bring to the business and entrepreneurship realm. I have been so profoundly humbled by this space. It continues. You think you know it all, and you just this space really does humble you, from capital markets to cultivation to the sophistication of processing. It's just there's never a dull moment. The legal and political environment. It's I didn't need a huge dose of humble pie, but I can tell you I've got a double helping from this space.
What were some of the concerns that you had going in, or some of the things you were aware of that could become potential problems?
Yeah, the perception of physicians is that they kind of know it all, even when they step outside of their kind of core domain, being medicine. I kind of probably went into my first few entrepreneurial undertakings with that attitude, and you get a few threats of fines because you miss X, Y, or Z, or you have some things not go well, and you get humbled pretty quickly. The cannabis space really takes that to the next level. I look back to our humble roots in Minnesota. We raised, I think it was $3.6 million on an $8 million valuation for one of two licenses in Minnesota, one of the first sort of high quality merit-based selection processes at the time. But that was as big as I was able to think back then. And now you look at what's happened to this space just 5 years later, it's completely transformed. So it's been an amazing ride, and I'm probably completely unemployable after this, just given how stimulating this is. I can't imagine what someone would do after this type of an adventure. But feel very good about what Vireo is. We really are sort of. I feel like we're at the nadir in the capital markets right now. If you look at some of our metrics, we're in a very good spot. We have very interesting markets. We have the scientific focus. We generate IP, limited licenses, adult use is on the cusp in many of our markets. So feel very good about it. I feel like the adventure is just sort of starting. I plan on really hammering this out for another 4 or 5 years and seeing where this ends up.
And this is just sort of a general follow-up on your background as a physician. I think we hear a lot about the potential threat that physicians have looming over their head of malpractice, or the fact that they might be sued. When it comes to like working with cannabis, did that feel like opening a can of worms in any way, that either legally or just like, I don't know, did it give you pause at all to begin going down that?
It did. I was stepping out of, you have to realize that, it's a very litigious space being in emergency medicine. Your average emergency medicine physician gets sued once every 7 years for malpractice.
Wow.
And the thing people don't appreciate is that a physician can perform flawlessly and still end up with a lawsuit because of a bad outcome. And if you have a tragic outcome in somebody who's young or a child, you can just, those get settled because, it doesn't matter what the facts are. You throw this family who has had a bad outcome for their child, independent of the facts, any jury is likely going to be pretty, sympathetic to them. And that's just the way it is. I managed, and I guess the statute of limitations is passed. I'm knocking on wood here to not end up in court with malpractice, but I definitely bucked the odds doing it for 10 years. And so that, that was really, very litigious, that was in the back of your mind as an ER doc, even as a fairly experienced one at the end of my tenure. Stepping into cannabis, one of the first things I did was take a really hard look at sort of the risk profile. And that was what really convinced me to step into this space, was just that the risks that I expected to see just weren't there. Obviously we don't want, young people using cannabis to excess. We don't want pregnant people using cannabis. There's probably some downsides for those that are, unstable from a psychiatric standpoint, like, schizophrenia, et cetera. But I was very impressed by what I perceived to be a very low risk profile with cannabis. And that was a big, gave me comfort to step into the space.
Yeah, give me a little bit more insight into that thought process. Like, as you're considering moving into this space, as a doctor, I'm sure that there's a number of things that you probably need to kind of like cross off your list before you'll feel comfortable. And there are a lot of sort of standing perceptions about people who consume cannabis that in some ways are based on old studies or partial pictures. And I'm thinking sort of how much and how long cannabis can affect, for instance, memory.
No, there are a few things that the kind of boxes I had to check. So, stepping into this, I knew that we had to do things the right way. I wanted to absolutely maximize safety for folks. And so this would be something like working with Safety Call International on something that's called post-market surveillance, essentially following your products to make sure there aren't side effects. And so we've actually been doing that in Minnesota, New York, Pennsylvania here for years. And so when the scare with vapes came out last fall, we were actually in a pretty good spot. If I did not have reams of data demonstrating safety for our products, I would have been very nervous. I knew kind of right off the bat that something fishy was going on and that some adulterant was likely being added to the vaporizers, because we just weren't seeing any side effects of consequence. And so it turns out vitamin E acetate's likely at least the partial culprit there. And we just monitor. We take a little bit different approach in that we're going to tell the truth, even if it's not ideal. If we see side effects over time from some product in cannabis, we're going to let the world know that, because we think that's pretty important. So I wasn't going to compromise sort of my medical background and the first do no harm, Hippocratic oath. We really wanted to do things the right way. We're going to monitor our products for safety. And so we did that. Very proud of our track record of safety in all of our markets with all of our products thus far.
Now, you've talked previously about the potential for cannabis to be something that really helps with what has been termed the opioid crisis. And we hear those terms, both the opioid crisis or the opioid epidemic, in the media constantly. And I don't know if it's helpful. I mean, it's two words that sums up quite a lot of history and a lot of pain. And when we talk about the opioid epidemic, I mean, broadly, what does that really mean?
Yeah, I have a unique perspective there. Having been in the emergency department for over a decade, you really are kind of in the front lines with the opioid crisis. And, it's many things. But the reality is we're not great at treating chronic pain in people, and the opioids in particular. Although they're an effective treatment for some, it's really problematic. You see people with escalating needs. You see heroin use. I remember actually 2 cases of young affluent teenagers from suburbia coming in with heroin overdoses in the emergency department, which was pretty unusual. And, it's very common that people sort of escalate their dosing over time. An interesting thing with the opioid crisis is it's really hard to assign blame if you're fully informed, because a lot of people, they step into this, with nothing volitional. They break their ankle, they're on pain meds for a week or two, and they're already starting to develop physiologic addiction. And, some people are more prone to it genetically than others. And so for so many people, living with pain, opioids has been kind of the only choice. For me, if you step back and take a look at the cost-benefit analysis of opioids versus cannabis really is a no-brainer. And, cannabis is not without peril. I want to be clear about that. But if you look at it compared to opioids, it's pretty laughable, if you compare the risks of the two. Opioids, I would routinely see overdoses. That was a very common thing. Drug-seeking behavior, which is a tax on the medical system. Again, no blame being assigned there. It's just, the opioid crisis is here to stay, but cannabis is a very interesting alternative for many people in the chronic pain realm, especially.
So I'd love to dig into that a little bit, and I understand that, to some degree this might be a sensitive question, but if you ever did prescribe opiates. Was that something that like gave you pause? Was that something that you thought about, before you did it? Was it a hard choice to make?
Well, there's a spectrum of people that need opioids. There are people that have
Mm-hmm.
crushed their ankle who, there's no over the counter remedy there. You can take all ibuprofen and Tylenol you want. You're not going to get pain relief. And so you just need to be
Yeah.
cognizant. And I would have conversations with people, and it kind of escalated by the end of my tenure where these conversations became more and more prevalent. You're obviously these people need pain medicine and you're going to give them that. You're probably going to give them a limited quantity, 2, 3, 4 days until they can see their primary doctor or a specialist. And for folks with chronic pain, you'd often do just a few doses. That's where it got to be at the end because we were, very much under the microscope with any opioid prescriptions, and appropriately so. And so I would give people the benefit of the doubt, that was kind of my default. But it would often be, fairly limited quantities, and just the key is really prompt follow up. And one of the things we would do is if people don't follow up, that's a pretty big red flag the next time they come in for their Vicodin or Percocet or pain meds. But people who made a legitimate effort, we would give them the benefit of the doubt. And obviously people with acute injury, that's kind of a no-brainer.
And so looking back on some of those experiences, would there have been situations where you would have substituted cannabis for opiates in your own prescriptions? Like, are there cases where you'd be like, yeah, this is more appropriate or this would have worked potentially for this person?
Yeah, certainly in chronic pain, it would be worth a shot. A little bit less evidence in my, at least that as I understand it, there's less evidence in acute pain with cannabis. So I sort of see cannabis as a little bit more on the chronic end of things, and primary care physicians and pain specialists, that's kind of their place. It'll be interesting to see if there's an augmented role for cannabis from the emergency department in acute care setting over time. That's pretty interesting. Does high dose THC in lieu of opioids in the setting of a broken ankle, is that a meaningful treatment? I don't know the answer to that, but it's likely that there's some at least adjunctive quality there, and some helpful quality of cannabis in acute pain too.
And do you have a sense of is cannabis, when it comes to pain relief, comparable to aspirin or sort of over the counter average painkillers? Is it stronger? Does it kind of depend on the person?
Yeah. It does. It really does depend on the person. There's going to be a genetic overlay to this. The same dose of the same medicine in two different people can be quite different. And my feeling is that cannabis has even more of a variety than many of the pain meds that we've seen as far as the diverse outcomes for a given dose across a population. Some people seem to be very sensitive and others not, both from a side effect and symptom control standpoint. And so there's a lot to be learned there. I probably defer to my chief medical officer on that type of question as far as the actual state of evidence. But we're excited to learn a lot more about this and figure out, where does cannabis, the many formulations, and again, cannabis is not like aspirin, which is sort of a binary switch. Cannabis represents potentially thousands of medications in combination. So it's a much broader category of therapy. And I'm much more bullish on the potential outcomes across the spectrum of therapies versus something like aspirin. It's just, aspirin's kind of a blunt tool. It's an on-off switch. You take it and it works or it doesn't at various doses. Cannabis is so much more refined than that, so much more complex, so much more interesting, and hopefully beneficial to folks.
How does it feel to you, the state of affairs that we kind of have when politically, our political leaders kind of say, we need more science or we need more data to embrace cannabis, but we acknowledge there's an opioid crisis, but you're allowed to continue to prescribe them. I mean, does that feel right to you, or do you have an opinion on that state of affairs?
Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of an accident of history. Opioids, generally speaking, were kind of grandfathered in to where they are, similar to aspirin. And it's just, it's fascinating to me that cannabis is just so difficult to study. That's another accident of history. It's some xenophobia, some racism mixed in with a few folks that wanted to make a lot of money back in 1937 And that's kind of what led to this. It's not right. There's no scientific basis for it. The only thing that slows us down is sort of this residual stigma. But I feel like with the current generation of politicians, as they move on, I think that sort of dies with them. It's just there's no rational basis for cannabis being a Schedule I substance. That just doesn't make any sense.
And is it your perception that like the general public agrees with that sentiment, that kind of understands that there are some risks potentially to having opiates prescribed and medicinally cannabis might be a safer option for them?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, opioids have their place. They absolutely have their place. But I think that the most folks, certainly those under 50 or 60, polling shows, support cannabis in droves. And I think that, as the older generation, like I said, just the change out of the current political apparatus, those, 50 and 60 and older, as we get the younger politicians in there with a different set of views, I think that this will fall like dominoes. And I hope common sense will prevail, although politics and common sense in the same sense is always kind of perilous. You never know with politics and politicians.
Yeah. So you mentioned already just like the whirlwind of change that kind of is this industry. And we've seen already cannabis start to become a political issue in a number of different avenues. It's kind of come up in reference to attacks against Kamala Harris. It's starting to look like cannabis is going to become a political topic. How do you look to the future as a business leader? How do you prepare for this, and how are you thinking about this year?
Yeah, you have to prepare for multiple outcomes there, and we're pretty comfortable with the full spectrum. The dysfunction, and this is just strictly as a business person, the dysfunction is part of the opportunity, right? We have these strange siloed state-based programs, and that's kind of the opportunity for we as Vireo, as a mid-sized multi-state operator. We've really been able to get a toehold in these limited license states. In a complete liberalized, free-for-all type scenario, it's a little bit harder to get a start. That being said, sort of my humanist considerations kind of trump the business considerations here. We're very excited about wholesale federal change that enables access for people, takes this out of the black market, inserts safety, inserts standards, takes it to the Mexican drug cartels. It's a great thing for humanity. The war on opioids is very exciting to me. I also see cannabis as a real alternative in the more adult use space, as an alternative to alcohol and probably tobacco, without probably the downsides long term. Alcohol is such a huge tax on society. It's completely accepted. The stigma is gone. And the fact that that's the case for alcohol, but not for cannabis, blows my mind. And so we've kind of made that our mission. It's my mission in this life, is to develop and, sell, distribute cannabis-based alternatives to opioids, alcohol, and tobacco. If I can do that, I think it will have been a life well lived.
Dr. Kyle Kingsley is the CEO and chairman of Vireo Health. Dr. Kingsley, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.
You can find more cannabis industry reporting at TRICHOMES.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at highground at TRICHOMES.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at TRICHOMES.com and following us on all social media. The High Ground is produced by David Fortin. I'm Jesse Betend. Thank you for listening.